You're damn right, thank God it's Monday. Even though it's the third Monday in January, which is generally seen as the most depressing day of the year. And I think the theory behind that is because most people understand the concept that it takes 3 weeks to develop the habits necessary to promote lasting change. So on the third week of January or the third Monday in January, all those people that had high aspirations with their New Year's resolutions have come to the realization that they haven't done what they thought they were going to do or what they needed to do to promote the lasting change that they wanted to see. So as a result, they end up killing themselves or committing suicide because they see themselves as a failure. As it relates to training to build muscle, though, I'd argue that failing doesn't make you a failure. In fact, training to failure might be what you need to do to maximize your return on investment of time and effort in the gym, at least if you want to build the most amount of muscle through your training. So one of the things I want to talk about real quick is the difference between performing high reps and taking a set to failure. Now, when I talk about failure in this context, it's implied that you're using a light enough weight to perform a lot of reps in the first place because you're not going to get the same training effect by lifting a weight that makes you fail after performing 2 or 3 reps. So when you perform a high amount of reps, what happens is there's an accumulation of metabolites. This can facilitate failure because lactate and hydrogen ions create an acidic environment, reducing the nervous system's capacity to recruit muscles. There will also be a state of oxygen deprivation achieved, similar to an occlusion effect. Now, when you keep your muscles under constant tension, there's an occlusion effect. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Now, you don't need to keep them under constant tension to get this effect, because if you perform a high amount of reps, the muscles never really get a chance to fully relax, so create a similar effect. This can facilitate failure because reduced oxygen energy production can result in the incapacity to produce the force necessary to overcome the resistance and perform more reps. But the biggest difference between training to failure and not is that the result it will have on fatigue. Now, if you want to build the most amount of muscle possible, you want to recruit and fatigue as many muscle fibers as possible without overworking your body's capacity to recover. So while there will be some degree of fatigue when performing a high amount of reps, it won't be to the same degree because you do not perform a maximal voluntary contraction. And this is only accomplished by training to failure. So what happens is when you try to train to failure, muscles are recruited as they're needed. As they start to fatigue, more are recruited to meet the demand. And if you train to failure, it's indicative that you will have recruited and fatigued as many muscle fibers as possible within that specific effort as you could. So that's the greatest difference maker between training to failure or stopping shy of failure. Now, whether you train to failure or not, and you do perform a high amount of reps, you'll stimulate growth because both failing and not failing but performing a high amount of reps will result in increased local growth factors, and they will both stimulate the ERK pathway if the muscles are under tension for long enough, because that is a time under tension dependent pathway. But the major difference, as I said, is that only training to failure requires a maximal voluntary contraction to be performed. Now, when I talk about failure, there's 2 types of failure. There's muscle failure and movement failure. So we're talking about muscle failure to promote growth. What happens is when you're doing a compound movement like a bench press or a squat or a deadlift, the load is spread over all the muscles involved in the lift. And when you reach failure, it's not because any specific muscle actually is failing, but because of the sum of all the muscles involved can no longer produce the force necessary to overcome the resistance. Therefore, you're failing. And what happens is if you try to reach failure when performing these movements, what you might do is take stress off the muscle you're trying to target because it's fatiguing and put it onto other muscles because you're compensating so that you can facilitate more reps to be performed. This is not going to facilitate growth in the same way. So that's something that I wanted to touch on real quick. If you like this information, feel free to share. Click the fucking button at the bottom, subscribe to the channel. I'll keep bringing you the best information that there is, period, as it relates to training to build muscle and get stronger. And I'll keep explaining it in a way that anybody can practically apply it immediately so they can maximize the return on investment of time and effort, so they get the best results for their effort, so they don't feel like a fucking failure and want to kill themselves like everybody else does on the third Monday in January.